Hello again. In this second episode about Michel Foucault, we're going to explore the idea of biopower. Um, okay. In the previous episode, we were talking about the disciplinary power, how institutions shape individual bodies. Now, Foucault makes a bigger move here. He says modern power doesn't just discipline individuals; it manages entire populations as living organisms. So he calls this biopower. To understand biopower, we need to see what it has replaced. What sort of system it has been replaced by what we call biopower. Before modernity, power was, according to Michel Foucault, simple and brutal. And note that he is here referring to the European, more specifically, the European historical context. So the king had one basic power, and that was the power to kill you. Public executions, torture, war. The so-called sovereign demonstrated power by deciding who lives and who dies. And Foucault's formula for this is the sovereign has the right or had the right to take life or let live. Now, you exist at a mercy of such a king in such a situation. If it doesn't kill you, you live, and that's it. So modern power, however, inverts this kind of system completely. The modern state doesn't primarily threaten to kill you. It manages how you live. It is interested in your health, your reproduction, your diet, your fitness, your lifespan, your productivity, etc., etc. Foucault's formula for modern power is the opposite. Make live and let die. So the state actively intervenes to keep populations alive, healthy and productive through public health systems, vaccination campaigns, sanitation programs, mental health programs, nutrition guides, workplace safety regulations, just name it. So it doesn't hold a sword over your head. It holds a clipboard. And the let die part is just as important. Modern states rarely execute their citizens, especially in public. So, but they let people die all the time. How? Through neglect, through policy choices, poor policy choices, I would say, through the withdrawal of resources. Think about which communities get, I know, hospitals and which don't. Which populations get clean water and which don't. Who gets access to medicine and who has to wait longer waiting lists. That's let die part of it, not the active killing of sovereign power, but the calculated management of who thrives and who is allowed to decline. Now, COVID, for instance, made this very visible. Governments openly weighed economic costs against people's lives. That's biopower in action. The administration of life and death at the population level, not the individual level, at the population. Now, Foucault says biopower operates at two levels, and this distinction really matters. The first level he calls anatoma politics, power over individual bodies. And this is what we've already been discussing, discipline, the shaping of bodies to be healthy, productive, fertile, and useful. Your GP telling you to lose weight, your employer requiring medical exam, a government campaign telling you how much to drink, how much to exercise, how many hours to sleep. Each of these is a kind of a micro intervention that is aimed at making our individual bodies more manageable, more productive, more optimized. And the second level he calls biopolitics of population. And this is the bigger concept. Here power operates not on our bodies, especially, but on the population as the statistical entity. Birth rates, death rates, life expectancy, fertility rates, migration patterns, disease, prevalence, public health indicators, and the like. So the population becomes a thing that can be measured, graphed, compared across countries, and governed through policy. Think about how governments talk, our obesity rate is rising, our birth rate is declining, our life expectancy is falling behind comparable nations, and the like. So the individual, have disappeared. You're not a person anymore. You're a population. So you've become a data point in a population level management system. And these two levels reinforce each other. The government wants to improve the population health statistics, so it designs campaigns targeting individual bodies. Eat 5 portions of fruit and vegetables, walk 10,000 steps a day. Get your annual screening. You internalize these norms, and this way you monitor yourself. So your self-discipline at the individual level fits the population level statistics that the state manages. Anatomopolitics and biopolitics are not separate systems. They're two gears in the same machine. Now, one concrete example that connects both levels is, of course, you must have already guessed it, COVID vaccination. At the population level, the government tracks vaccination rates, sets targets, models herd immunity thresholds. This is biopolitics, managing the population as a biological mass. At the individual level, you get a letter from your GP, you book an appointment, you present your arm, you carry a vaccination record, and that's the politics, disciplining the individual body. And the two levels meet in the vaccine passport, a technology that links your individual biological status to your rights as a member of the population. Can you travel? Can you enter this venue? Can you keep your job? Your individual body becomes a checkpoint in a population management system, and a point that makes this distinctly Foucauldian rather than just a description of our public health. None of this requires anyone to be evil or conspiratorial. Public health officials genuinely want to improve health outcomes. Vaccination genuinely saves lives. Foucault is not saying biopower is always bad. He's saying it's power, a specific historically modern form of power that governs through care rather than through threat, that manages life rather than, commanding death. And that is all, the more effective, because it appears as benevolence rather than domination. It appears as care rather than suppression. So the state that vaccinates you is also the state that classifies you, tracks you, and determines your rights based on your biological status. So care and control are not opposites in biopower. And that's a very interesting one. Care and control are not opposites here. They're the same operation. And that's the shift we need to grasp from a power that says, obey or I'll kill you, to a power that says, let me help you live better. And in doing so, enters every aspect of your life. Now, sexuality here is an interesting, I would say, um, a construct of power from Foucault's point of view. This is one of Foucault's most, I would say, counterintuitive arguments, and it takes a moment to land. So let me set it up, hopefully clearly. The common sense story about sex or sexuality and modernity goes like this. You know, people in the Victorian era were kind of sexually repressed. They didn't talk about sex. They were not allowed to do that. They hid it, denied it, punished it. Then gradually through 20th century, we liberated ourselves. The sexual revolution, the pill, gay rights, sex education, open conversations everywhere. And we moved from silence to speech, from repression to freedom. And that's the story most of us may carry around, without thinking about it. Foucault says this story is almost entirely wrong. And his argument is not really complicated. It's just surprising. Look at the Victorians a little bit more closely into the records. And were they really silent about sex? Foucault says, go and actually look at what they produced. The Victorians generated an enormous quantity of discourse about sex. You know, medical textbooks were published and classified sexual behaviors. You know, psychiatric manuals, diagnosed sexual disorder, legal codes, regulating sexual conducts, religious confessional manuals, required detailed accounts of sexual thoughts. Government requires, government inquiries into prostitution, venereal diseases, and public morality. Schools developing, policies about childhood sexuality, census data tracking marriage, fertility, and illegitimate births. And this is not silence. This is an explosion of talk, but a very specific kind of talk. Sex was not being repressed, it was being produced as an object of knowledge. And it was being studied, classified, categorized, and brought under the authority of experts, doctors, psychiatrists, priests, legislators, educators. And the Victorians didn't stop talking about sex. They couldn't stop talking about sex. They just insisted that only certain people, professionals, authorities, experts, were allowed to talk about it, and only in certain kind of authorized ways. So now here is where it connects to biopower. Why did modern states become so obsessed with sex? Not because politicians were perverts, because sex is where individual bodies and population management meets, right? This is where the anatomopolitics and biopolitics meet. So sex produces children, which means it's directly connected to birth rates, labor force size, military strength, national productivity, right? So sex transmits diseases, which means it's a public health concern. Sex happens in families, which means it's connected to the regulation of households, inheritance, welfare cost, social stability. Once you see sex as a population management issue, you need knowledge about it, and you need to know who is doing what with whom. You need categories, and this is Foucault's most radical claim. The categories we use to understand sexuality, like heterosexuality, homosexual, normal, not normal, deviant, healthy, perverse, are not descriptions of pre-existing natural types, Foucault would say. So they were invented through this process of knowledge production. Take the word, for instance, homosexual. It was coined in 1868. Before that, the category didn't exist. That doesn't mean people weren't having same-sex relations. Of course, they were, throughout history, but they weren't understood as a type of a person. Homosexual. There were acts, things you did, but not identities. So you might commit sodomy, which was a kind of a sin or a crime like stealing, but you weren't a homosexual any more than someone who stole bread was a kleptomaniac. So the act didn't define your entire being. But then what changed? Psychiatry and sexology created a new category. The person who engages in same-sex acts became the homosexual, kind of a species, a medical type with a specific, psychology or physiology, a characteristic, anatomy, a life history, a childhood that could be investigated, a condition that could be diagnosed. The act became an identity, and once it was an identity, it could be studied, treated, regulated, and controlled. And psychiatrists could diagnose it. Courts could sentence you. Governments could deny you your rights, not for what you did, but for what you were. And that's what Foucault means when he says power doesn't repress sex, it produces sexuality. So the entire framework through which we understand ourselves as sexual beings, the categories, the identities, the norms about what's healthy and what's deviant, was produced by modern institution for the purpose of management and control. And here's the twist that we often miss. This applies to normal sexuality too, not just to the categories we now recognize as oppressive. The heterosexual as a concept, the heterosexual identity was also invented. The word actually came after homosexual. So the normal is just as constructed as the deviant. You needed the deviant category to define the normal one. So they produce each other. The married, reproductive, monogamous, heterosexual couple isn't a natural baseline against which everything else is measured. It's a category that was produced at the same time by the same institution that produced the homosexual, the pervert, the hysteric categories. So the whole grid is an invention, not the desires themselves, but the way we categorize, name, and govern those desires. So one practical consequence to make this concrete, think about a form, any government form that asks for your marital status, single, married, divorced, widow, de facto. This is biopower. It's the state, sorting you into a sexual reproductive category for what? For administrative purposes. Or think about the census, forms or surveys. Dylan in her chapter discusses this. The census doesn't just count people; it categorizes households by a structure. Married couple with children, single parents, same-sex couple, etc., etc. So each category carries assumptions about sexual behavior, reproductive capacity, and social function. The seemingly boring act of filling in a census form is a biopolitical technology, machinery. It makes your sexual and reproductive life legible to the state. So the key inside the liberationist story is that the liberationist story, we were, we were repressed and now we are free, misses the point. We were never simply silenced about sex. We were incited to talk about it in a specific ways to specific authorities in a specific categories, and those categories didn't describe what was already there. They created the framework, through which we understand ourselves as sexual beings. Foucault isn't saying sex doesn't exist. He is saying sexuality, the whole system of categories, identities, norms, and expert knowledge is a historical invention. And it was invented because modern power needs to govern life, and sex is where life is produced. Now let's make this a little bit more concrete. And we've so far established that biopower governs life, and that sexuality is a key site of that kind of governance. Now look at how this actually operates around us, around you, not in a Victorian era, but right now. Start with the public health, right? Sexual health education in the schools. Who decides what children learn about sex, at what age, in what language. So that is not a kind of a neutral educational decisions. It's a biopolitical one. The content, determines which sexual behaviors are presented as normal, healthy, and responsible, and which are presented as risky, deviant, or absent altogether. And in some curricula, homosexuality is discussed openly. In others, it's not mentioned at all. In some countries, as I'm sure you know, teaching about it is very illegal. And each of these choices is a biopolitical intervention. The state governing how young people understand their own sexuality. Contraception access works the same way. Free contraception, contraception for certain populations is presented as healthcare, and it is. But it is also population management, right? So which populations get targeted with family planning campaigns? Historically and still today, the answer correlates uncomfortably with race and class. Wealthy white population are encouraged to have more children. Think about government incentives for families, tax benefits for married couples. Concern about declining birth rates. Poor communities, indigenous communities, communities of color have historically been targeted with the opposite message. And sometimes with forced sterilization. Same technology, same discourse of reproductive health. Radically different application depending on whose reproduction the state wants to encourage and whose it wants to limit. So as you can see, we're expanding or extending Foucault's idea of biopower into the realm of racial discriminations and inequalities. So that is biopower operating through care. Not saying we're controlling your reproduction, but we're helping you make healthy choices. The language is supportive. The effect is, of course, governance. So here's one that might surprise you. For instance, during COVID, if you may remember, the World Health Organization issued guidelines on sexual behavior, recommending against kissing, suggesting you minimize the number of partners, advising that masturbation was the safest sexual option. Think about that for a moment. A global health body during a respiratory pandemic issued official guidance on how you should conduct your intimate life, and nobody, forced compliance. It was advice, not law, but it was authoritative advice, backed by institutional power, covered by media, circulated on social media. The state, or in this case, the global public health apparatus, reached into your bedroom, into your most private physical interactions, and told you what was safe and what wasn't. So that's biopower at its most intimate. And most people didn't find it remarkable because it came dressed as health advice. Now, state policy, which biopower becomes explicit law. As an example of this, I would say China's one-child policy is the textbook example. The state directly controlled how many children you could have. Not through advice, through penalties, forced abortions, forced sterilizations, financial incentives, and punishments. You are, of course, not losing your head, but these were the measures. So the purpose was, quite explicitly biopolitical. Manage the population size to match available resources. Individual reproductive desires was subordinated entirely to population level management. So your body, your family, your most personal decisions governed by demographic statistics. But you don't need to go to China. Anti-abortion laws in the United States, in Poland, across Latin America, these are biopolitical interventions. The state decides what you can do with your own reproductive capacity as a woman. And the arguments on both sides are framed in biological terms on both sides. Protecting life, pro-life kind of thing, reproductive rights, or pro-choice side, from the pro-choice side, women's health, the unborn child. Both sides are operating within biopower's logic. Both are, claiming authority over the governance of the life itself. They disagree about how life should be governed, but not about whether it should be governed. So pro-natalist policies work the other direction. Hungary offers tax exemptions and loan forgiveness, or for families with multiple children. Australia, if you may remember, had a baby bonus. Peter Costello's baby bonus. These are states using financial incentives to increase birth rates. Managing the population's biological reproduction through economic levers. Nobody calls it biopower. They call it family policy. But the logic is the same. The state intervenes in reproduction because the population's biological composition is a political concern. Finally, as an example, the surveillance of sexuality is something we can discuss. And this has a dark history. Until 1973, homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder in the DSM, the diagnostic manual used by psychiatrists worldwide. And that meant a same-sex desire wasn't just socially disapproved, it was medically classified, clinically diagnosed, and subject to institutional intervention, conversion therapy, institutionalization, even chemical castration. The story of Alan Turing, right? The man who broke the Enigma code and helped win the Second World War, was convicted of gross indecency and chemically castrated by the British state. That is biopower in its most violent form. The state using medical authority to discipline a body that deviated from the reproductive norm. That was the norm that was medically set up. We'd like to think that's over, but and the explicit psychiatric classification is gone in many countries, but the surveillance has changed form. It hasn't disappeared. So think about what your health apps know about you, right? Period tracking apps record your menstrual cycles, your sexual activity, your fertility windows. After overturning of Roe versus Wade in the case in the United States, women were warned to delete their period tracking data because it could potentially be used as evidence of pregnancy and therefore of abortion. So your most intimate biological information entered, voluntarily by you into an app you downloaded for convenience, suddenly became a potential tool of a state surveillance. And that's the digital panopticon applied to reproductive life. Dating apps collect data on your sexual preferences, your partners, your location, your patterns of intimacy, and that data is of course stored, sold, and potentially accessible to state authorities or even other corporations. Grindr, the gay dating app, for instance, was found to be sharing users' HIV status with third-party companies. In countries where homosexuality is criminalized, dating app data has been used by police to identify, arrest, and prosecute gay men. The voluntary disclosure of intimate life, presented as connection, liberation, self-expression, becomes a surveillance infrastructure. So the key insight for this whole section, this episode, is that biopower transforms what feels most private: your body, your desires, your reproductive choices, your intimate life, into political concerns that are measured, managed, and governed. Sex is never just personal in a modern state. It is a mechanism of governance. And the fact that it doesn't feel like governance, that it feels like health advice, family policy, a convenient app, is precisely what makes biopower so effective. So the power that governs your intimate life is the power you're least likely to recognize as power because it arrives as care. Thank you, and now we end this episode.